The ultimatum arrived on a clear morning, printed in light across the whole sky of the colony world Harrow's Rest, and not one human being looked up in fear. Cass Holloway saw it first, because she was already outside, kneeling in the cold dirt of her seed plot with her gloves caked to the wrist. She was a grain warden, 41 years old, with a sunburned neck and a bad knee, and no rank that any soldier would respect. She grew oats and barley, and the hard red wheat that fed 3,000 families on a planet that the rest of the galaxy had never bothered to name correctly. She was not a fighter. She had never fired a weapon at anything larger than a burrow pest, and when the sky filled with the cold blue letters of an alien command, she read it the way she read a weather report, with her head tilted and her mouth slightly open. The letters were not words at first. They were symbols. Then they were a translation, and the translation was very polite, which was the part that made her stomach turn. The galaxy did not threaten Harrow's Rest. It informed it. It catalogued it. The thing in the sky called itself the Ledger of the Assembled Worlds, and it spoke the way a clerk speaks to a debtor who does not yet understand he has already lost. "You are being entered," the sky said. "Hold still while you are entered." Cass stood up slowly. Her knees popped. Around her the rows of young grain bent in the wind, and beyond them the low silver roofs of the settlement caught the morning. People were coming out of their doors now. Children, old men, a woman with a baby on her hip. They stood in their yards and on their porches, and they all looked up at the same sentence, and Cass watched their faces, and she did not see panic. She saw something slower and harder forming behind their eyes, the way frost forms on a window when nobody is watching. She had seen that look once before, years ago, on the day the dust storm took the western fields and the colony decided, in a single afternoon, to replant from the seed they had saved against starvation rather than ration and wait. It was the look of people who had already crossed something and were only now finding out what was on the other side. Cass pulled off one glove and shaded her eyes and read the rest of it, and her stomach turned again, colder this time. Cass Holloway had been born on Harrow's Rest. She did not remember the Dark Crossing. Her mother had carried her here in the third wave as an infant, and the planet was the only world she had ever known, the only sky, the only soil. She had grown up with the wheat. She knew the smell of it green, and the smell of it dry, and the sound it made in a wind off the foothills, a sound like the ocean she had never seen. Her whole life had been measured in harvests, 40 of them now, and she had never once thought of the galaxy out there beyond the blue as anything but a rumor. A thing that happened to other people on other worlds, far away, in the cold. The grain did not care about the galaxy. The grain needed water and warmth, and a warden who knew when to plant. And Cass had been that warden for 19 years, and she had been content, which is a thing the galaxy never taught its conquered worlds to value, and which is perhaps why it could not understand them. She had heard the stories, of course. Every colonist had. There were nights, when she was small, when the older settlers would gather in the long hall after the harvest was in, and the children were supposed to be asleep, and they would talk in low voices about the worlds that were gone. Cass had crept to the edge of the firelight more than once to listen. They spoke of the 3 lost colonies, the ones from before Harrow's Rest, the ones the dark had swallowed. They spoke of a thing that came out of the void, and measured a world, and then, very politely, ended it. They never raised their voices when they spoke of it. That was the part that had frightened her most as a child. Not the words, but the quiet. The way grown men and women dropped their voices to talk about the thing in the dark, as if it might be listening, as if even here, even this far out, it could hear its own name. Now the thing in the dark was in her sky, and it was as polite as the stories had promised, and Cass found that the fear she had carried as a child was not, after all, the thing that rose in her now. Something else rose in her now, and it surprised her, and it would surprise the Ledger far more. The Ledger was not a fleet, exactly. It was an institution. For 900 years it had been moving through the spiral arm cataloging everything it found, and the catalog was the conquest. To be entered into the Ledger was to be owned by it. Every star, every world, every species was assigned a value, a category, and a disposition. Most worlds were simply absorbed, taxed, and slowly emptied of anything worth taking. The species that resisted were given a different category, and that category was a number, and the number meant erasure, and the erasure was performed with such bookkeeping calm that the galaxy had stopped calling it war. They called it correction. 310 worlds had been corrected. Not one had ever been uncorrected. There was no record of a single entry in the ledger ever being reversed, because the ledger did not make mistakes, and a thing that cannot make mistakes has no need to imagine being wrong. Cass knew the number because every child on Harrow's Rest knew the number. They learned it the way other children learned their letters. 310. The teachers said it without explaining it, and the parents said it without explaining it. And only later, much later, did a person come to understand that the number was the reason the colony existed at all, and the reason it had been built where it had been built, and the reason there were certain ridges out past the cemetery that no one was ever to dig into, ever, for any reason, no matter what they thought they had found. So, when the ledger reached the small blue planet that humans called Harrow's Rest, it did what it always did. It performed an assessment. It measured the population, the industry, the orbital defenses, which were minimal, and the fleet presence, which the ledger recorded as 0. It found a farming colony of 3,008 souls, with 2 cargo haulers, 1 weather satellite, and a single decommissioned patrol cutter that had not flown in 11 years. It assigned humanity a category. The category was pending compliant, which meant a species that would kneel the moment it understood the alternative. Then it sent the ultimatum, and it waited the customary 12 hours for the kneeling to begin. The ledger had done this 310 times. It was very good at waiting. It had refined the waiting over centuries, because the kneeling, when it came, was always more efficient if you let the fear do the work. A world that surrendered in the first hour gave you a frightened, sullen population. A world that surrendered in the 11th hour, after a long night of staring at the sky and arguing in its halls and watching its children sleep, gave you a broken one. And a broken population was an obedient population, and obedience was the whole point. So the ledger waited, and it did not doubt, because in 900 years, the waiting had never once failed to produce a kneeling world by dawn. The ledger believed it understood fear completely. It had catalogued fear on 300 worlds. It had a model of it, refined over centuries, a precise predictive model of exactly how a population behaved when it understood it was going to die. First the disbelief, then the bargaining, the frantic transmissions, the offers of tribute and service and anything at all, if only the correction could be stopped. Then the turning inward, the blame, the collapse of order, the leaders torn down by their own people for failing to save them. And then, at last, the kneeling, the quiet broken kneeling, the population presenting itself for sorting because it had run out of any other thing to do. The ledger had watched this sequence play out 310 times, and it had never once varied, and so the ledger was certain it would not vary now. The model was the ledger's pride, insofar as a thing without pride can have one. It was the proof that the universe was, at bottom, predictable, that a world measured was a world known, that there were no surprises left in the dark for a thing 900 years old. But the model had been built from 310 worlds that all had one thing in common. They had all been alone. They had all looked up at the thing in their sky and understood, in their final hours, that no one was coming, that there was no fleet, no shield, no hidden strength, that they were exactly as helpless as the ledger had measured them to be. And a people who know they are helpless will, in the end, kneel, because kneeling is the only thing left to them. And the ledger had mistaken this for a law of the universe, when it was only a law of helplessness. The ledger had never once measured a world that was not helpless, and did not know it. It had never measured a world that was carrying, a kilometer beneath its grain, the answer to the oldest question in the dark. It was measuring one now, and the 12 hours it set aside for the kneeling would not be nearly long enough, because the thing it was waiting for was never going to come. Cass Holloway walked into the settlement hall while the sky was still glowing. The hall was already full. The colony's administrator, a tired man named Oren Vale, stood at the front with his hands flat on the table, and the room was loud with frightened voices, and over all of it, the translation kept scrolling down the windows in cold blue light. "Submit your registry," the sky said. "Surrender your orbital approaches. Disarm all hulls. Present your population for sorting. Compliance will be recorded as voluntary. Non-compliance will be recorded as resolved." Oren Vale looked very small under those words. He was not a general. He was a man who approved water rations and settled fence disputes, and now the oldest predatory institution in the spiral arm was asking him to hand over 3,000 people for sorting. He had a daughter in the second row, a girl of 9 with her mother's dark hair, and Cass watched him not look at her, watched him keep his eyes on the table, because if he looked at the girl, he would not be able to think, and Cass understood that he had already half decided, and that the half that had decided was the half that wanted his daughter to live until tomorrow, at any price. He raised his hands for quiet, and the room slowly gave it to him, and he opened his mouth to speak, and Cass already knew, from the gray color of his face, that he was about to tell them to comply, to buy time, to survive at any cost. It was the sensible thing. It was the thing every one of the 310 corrected worlds had done in their final hours. The sensible thing, right up until the ledger closed their account. The word compliance was already forming on his lips. Cass could see it. And she found that she had taken a step forward without deciding to. That her own mouth was open, that she, who had never spoken in a hall in her life, was about to say something, though she did not yet know what. But before Oren Vale could speak, and before Cass could, an old woman in the third row stood up. Her name was Marta Iden. She was 86 years old. She had come to Harrow's Rest as a girl on the second wave, before the silver roofs, before the grain, when the whole colony was tents and frozen mud, and a promise. She had buried a husband and 2 of her children in the cemetery on the hill, and she had outlived 3 administrators. And she stood now with both hands on a cane and her chin up, and the room went quiet for her in a way it had not gone quiet for the man at the front. "We don't kneel," Marta Iden said. Her voice did not shake. "We didn't cross all that dark to come here and kneel to a clerk." It was not a speech. It was 8 words and a breath. But Cass watched the 8 words move through the room like a current through water, and she watched the gray drain out of Oren Vale's face, and something else come into it, and she watched the frightened parents at the back stop looking at the sky, and start looking at each other, and she felt the thing in her own chest that had been cold all morning go suddenly, fiercely warm. Someone in the back said it next, quietly, "We don't kneel." And then a man near the door, and then a young mother with a baby, and then it was not 8 words anymore. It was 300 voices, then 1,000, the whole hall saying it, not shouting it, just saying it, the way you say a thing you have always known, and have only now been given permission to say out loud. "We don't kneel." Oren Vale stood at the front and listened to his colony refuse to die quietly, and Cass saw him finally look at his daughter, and the girl was saying it too, 9 years old with her chin up, exactly like the old woman's, and whatever had been gray in him was gone now, and would not come back. He went to the colony's old transmitter himself. He sent the ledger a reply of exactly 2 words, and the cold blue letters in the sky stopped scrolling, because they had not been programmed to receive it. The reply was, "We decline." The ledger of the assembled worlds had measured Harrow's Rest very carefully. It had counted the haulers and the satellite and the dead patrol cutter. It had counted the population, and assigned it a category, and predicted, with the certainty of 900 years and 310 corrections, exactly what these small soft farmers would do when the 12 hours ran out. It had counted everything on the surface of the planet, every roof, every road, every grain of the harvest, and it had been right about all of it, and it had been right about everything for 900 years, and so it did not occur to the ledger, even now, even with 2 human words sitting unanswerable in its registry, that it might have missed something. It had not counted what was under it. The colony of Harrow's Rest had a secret, and like most good secrets it was buried, and like most buried things, it was patient. When the first wave came to the planet 60 years before, they had not come empty. Humanity in those days was newly out into the dark, and it had learned a hard lesson on 3 earlier colonies that the ledger had quietly erased, before anyone back home even understood what the ledger was. The lesson was simple. A farming world looks helpless, and a helpless world gets corrected, and a corrected world leaves no one to send the warning home. So the planners who founded Harrow's Rest did a thing that looked, on every registry the galaxy could read, like nothing at all. They built the colony over a buried fleet. Not a fleet anyone could see, not a fleet that showed on any scan, because the whole point of it was that no scan would ever find it, until it was already too late. Beneath the grain plots and the silver roofs, beneath the cemetery on the hill and the settlement hall, and Cass Holloway's seed plot, sealed in vaults of stone and shielded rock a kilometer down, slept 11 warships of a class that humanity had built for exactly one purpose: to answer the Ledger, to be the thing the Ledger had never been able to imagine. They were called the deep-keel Dreadnoughts, and they were not patrol cutters or cargo haulers. Each one was 9 kilometers long. Each one carried weapons that had never been fired in front of a witness, and every one of them had been sleeping under a farm for 60 years, drinking power from the planet's own deep heat, waiting for a signal that everyone hoped would never come. The building of them was a story that no living colonist had heard in full, because the planners had been careful to scatter the pieces so that no one person could ever betray the whole. But the bones of it were these: humanity, in the first terrible decades after it understood what the Ledger was, had not built a navy. A navy could be found, a navy could be measured, and the moment the Ledger measured a human navy, it would assign humanity the category that meant erasure, and humanity in those days could not have survived the correction. So humanity did the opposite of building a navy. It built ghosts. It built ships designed never to be seen, never to be counted, never to appear on any registry in the spiral arm, and it hid them not in fortresses or behind fleets, but under farms, under the most harmless thing in the galaxy, a colony of people growing grain, because the Ledger's whole nature was to look at a harmless thing and write it down as harmless and move on. The Dreadnoughts had been a generation in the making. The metal of their hulls had been recovered, plate by plate, from the wrecks of the 3 lost colonies, salvaged in secret over 20 years by ships that pretended to be ore haulers, so that the Ledger's own corrections became the armor that would one day answer it. The weapons inside them had been built from the last broken recordings of how the Ledger killed, studied for 2 decades by people who never once spoke of their work above a whisper, until at last they had made something the recordings said could not be made. And then they had buried it all, 11 hulls, under a colony of farmers who did not know they were standing on it, and they had bound it to a single condition, and they had waited. The woman who had led the building was the chief planner of the first wave, and her name had been kept out of every record on purpose, so that no captured colonist could ever name her, and no scan could ever find her grave. The colonists who knew of her at all called her only the architect, and the few stories that survived made her sound less like a person than like a force. A woman who had stood at the edge of 3 dead worlds and decided, alone, that the dark would not have a fourth. She had been the one to understand that humanity could not win the dark by fighting the way the dark fought. The galaxy was full of fleets, full of weapons, full of empires that had risen to challenge the Ledger over 9 centuries, and every one of them had been measured and corrected and filed away, because the Ledger was older and patient, and it had time, all the time there was. And a fleet you can see is a fleet the Ledger can plan against. The architect had seen that the only weapon the Ledger could not plan against was a weapon it could not see, and the only thing it could not measure was a thing buried below the surface it measured, and so she had not built humanity a navy. She had built humanity a secret, and she had taught humanity to keep it, and the keeping had been the hardest part of all. Because a secret like this wants to be told. The colonists who knew, the 9 in each generation, carried a thing in their chests that could have saved them 1,000 sleepless nights if they had only spoken it, that could have comforted a frightened child, or steadied a grieving widow, or answered the colony's deepest fear with a single sentence. They never spoke it. For 60 years, across 3 generations, the 9 who knew watched their neighbors live and die in the honest belief that Harrow's Rest was exactly as helpless as it looked, and they let them believe it, because the architect had understood that a secret known by 3,000 is a secret known by the galaxy, and a fleet that the galaxy knows about is a fleet the galaxy can find, and a fleet the galaxy can find is no fleet at all. So the 9 carried it alone, each of them, and they chose their successors carefully, one in a generation chosen for the steadiness of their hands and the silence of their hearts, and they passed the secret down in the dark, a kilometer above 11 sleeping ships, and they waited for the day they all prayed would never come. The silence, in the end, was as much the weapon as the ships. The galaxy could have built 11 such hulls, given the years and the will. What it could not have done was hide them for 60 years under a farm and bind them to nothing but the courage of farmers. That trust was the thing the ledger could not measure, because it was not a number, and so the ledger looked at 3,000 farmers, and saw only 3,000 farmers, and never once saw the long vigil burning quietly beneath them. The signal had a name. The colonists who knew about it, and there were only 9 living people on Harrow's Rest who did, called it the refusal. It was not a button. It was not a code shouted into a radio. The planners had been wiser than that, because a code can be coerced, and a button can be pressed by a frightened man. The refusal was a vote. The 11 Dreadnoughts would not wake to save a population that had already surrendered. They would only wake for a people who had chosen, freely and with the enemy's blade at their throat, not to kneel. This was the deepest wisdom in the whole design, and Cass Holloway would not understand it fully until the day she died. The fleet was built to defend Defiance, and only Defiance, because the planners understood the one thing the ledger never would. A weapon that protects cowards protects nothing. A weapon that protects courage is unstoppable, because it can never be turned against the people who carry it. A frightened world, given such a fleet, would surrender the fleet itself in its first hour of fear, would hand it over to buy a day, would use it to kneel more comfortably. So the planners had built a fleet that could not be surrendered, because it would not rise for anyone who wished to surrender. It listened, down in the deep, not for a code or a command, but for a free people choosing, with everything to lose, to say no. And until it heard that, it would sleep, no matter who begged it, no matter what blade was at the colony's throat. It was the most patient weapon ever built, and the most loyal, because it was loyal not to a person or a flag, but to a single human act. Cass Holloway did not know any of this when she walked out of the settlement hall. She only knew that an 86-year-old woman had refused to kneel, and that the whole room had refused with her, and that Orrin Vale had straightened his back and sent the ledger a reply of exactly 2 words that the cold blue letters had not been programmed to receive. The reply was, "We decline." The sky did not understand at first. The ledger of the assembled worlds had a category for nearly everything, but it had no category for this, because in 900 years, no pending compliant world had ever declined. The translation flickered. The polite scrolling letters stopped, started, asked for clarification. It resent the ultimatum, more slowly, the way one repeats a word to a child. Submit your registry. Surrender your orbital approaches. And Orrin Vale, standing in the hall with 3,000 frightened people behind him, and his hands no longer shaking, sent the same 2 words again. We decline. The ledger ran the response through its language subsystems 11,000 times, certain it had mistranslated. It had not. It checked the colony's posture for the hidden signs that always accompanied a bluff, the quiet mobilization, the evacuation of leaders, the panicked transmissions to distant allies begging for rescue. There were none. The colony was not bluffing, and it was not calling for help. It was simply declining, calmly, with the certainty of people who had decided something long ago and were only now being asked the question. And the ledger, which had a category for fear and a category for bargaining and a category for desperate last resistance, had no category at all for a small farming world that looked at the end of itself and was not afraid. In the settlement hall, after the 2 words had been sent, the colony did a thing the ledger could not have predicted, because the ledger's model had no place for it. It went back to work. Orrin Vale, his hands no longer shaking, told the colony quietly that whatever was going to happen would happen, and that until it did, the irrigation gates still needed opening, and the morning livestock still needed feeding, and the young ones still needed minding, and that he, for one, intended to die, if he was going to die, with the work done and the fences mended. And the colony, which had just refused the oldest predator in the galaxy, nodded, and broke up, and went back to its fields. Cass would think of that, later, as the bravest thing she ever saw, braver even than the Dreadnoughts, braver even than Marta Iden standing up. 3,000 people with the end of the world hanging in their sky, going out to water the grain, because the grain still needed water, and because they had decided that the ledger could take their lives, but it could not take the shape of their days, not in the time they had left. Cass had gone back to her own seed plot for a few minutes, before she followed the old woman to the water plant. She had knelt in the cold dirt where she had been kneeling when the sky filled with letters, and she had pressed her bare hand flat against the soil, the way she did sometimes to feel the warmth of the deep ground coming up through it, the planet's own heat that the colony tapped for its power. The soil had been warm, as it always was. And Cass had not known, kneeling there with her palm flat against the warm earth, that a kilometer below her hand, 11 engines were already beginning to stir, that the warmth she had felt her whole life without thinking was the heat of the world feeding the thing that was about to rise. She would think of that too, later. She had been touching it the whole time. Her whole life she had been touching it, and she had thought it was only the ground. That was when the 9 who knew went down into the deep. There was an old maintenance shaft behind the water plant that everyone assumed led to the geothermal taps. It did lead there, eventually, but 300 meters down it branched, and the branch had a door that no key on the surface could open, and behind the door was an elevator that had been waiting 60 years with its lights off. Cass was not one of the 9. She did not see them go, but she saw old Marta Iden being helped toward the water plant by 2 grim-faced men she had never thought of as anything but farmers, a thresher named Bel Caro, and a quiet irrigation man named Dos Pell. And she saw the way they looked at the sky, the way you look at a debt you have always known would come due, and she followed, because something in her had decided she was done growing grain for the day. She caught up to them at the door behind the water plant, and Bel Caro turned and saw her, and did not send her away. He only looked at her for a long moment, this woman with dirt still on her gloves, and then he said, quietly, "You'll want to see this, Warden. You stood up in there same as anyone." And he held the door, and Cass Holloway stepped through it, and the floor sank away beneath her into the dark. Down in the deep, in a control vault the size of the settlement hall, the 9 gathered around a single console under a low red light. The vault was old. The metal of its walls was the same salvaged plate as the hulls themselves, and Cass could see, where the red light caught them, the scars and weld lines of 3 dead colonies built into the very room, and she understood without being told that she was standing inside the colony's true heart, the thing it had been built to hide and to protect, and, if it ever came to it, to use. The eldest of the 9 was Marta Iden herself, because the refusal had been written into the colony's bones by her generation, and it was her hand, 86 years old and steady as stone, that the system had been built to recognize. She had been a girl when the first wave came, but she had been more than a girl, Cass realized now. She had been one of the children chosen, raised her whole long life to be the living key, taught to hold a single act in her hands across 60 years, and never to spend it cheaply, and never, until this morning, to spend it at all. She crossed the vault slowly with her cane, and the others stepped back to let her, and she put her palm flat on the cold plate. As she crossed the vault, Cass saw the others, the 8 who were not Marta, and she knew every one of their faces from the fields and the markets and the long halls, and she had never once suspected, in all the years she had known them, that they carried this. Bel Caro, who threshed grain and told bad jokes at the harvest feast. Dos Pell, who fixed the irrigation lines and had a stutter and was kind to dogs. A baker named Wren Tully, who had pulled bread from her oven for Cass 1,000 mornings. A young man, the youngest of the 9, a herder barely 20, named Sim Oates, who had clearly been chosen and trained in secret since boyhood, and who stood now white-faced and steady, the next generation's living key, the one who would carry the secret forward, if today did not end the colony. 9 ordinary people, 9 names you would never look at twice, and they had been holding the heaviest thing in the spiral arm the whole time, quietly, in the dark, while they baked bread and threshed grain, and were kind to dogs. The plate read the lines of her, the warmth of her, the small electric truth of a living human who had chosen. A voice spoke in the vault. It was not a machine voice. The planners had not wanted a machine to be the last thing that asked this question, because a machine would have asked it the same way every time, and this question deserved to be asked as if it had never been asked before. So they had recorded a human voice, a woman long dead now, the chief planner of the first wave, and her words came up out of the dark warm and clear, and Cass saw old Marta Iden close her eyes at the sound of it, because it was a voice she had known as a girl, a voice that had taught her what her hand was for. "You are about to wake the deep keel," the dead woman said. "We built them to defend your refusal and nothing else. If you have surrendered, take your hand away now, and let them sleep, and they will protect you no further. because they were never meant to protect the kneeling. But if you have refused, if you have looked at the thing in your sky and told it no, then say it once more, here, where it counts, and the keels will rise. The vault was very quiet. Cass found that she was holding her breath. Marta Iden did not take her hand away. "We refuse," she said. And a kilometer beneath the grain, 11 engines that had not turned in 60 years began, very slowly, to turn. Cass felt it in the vault first, a deep vibration coming up through the salvaged floor, and then she saw the 9 around her begin, one by one, to weep, not from fear but from something far older, the breaking of a 60-year vigil, the moment a promise made by the dead is finally kept by the living. Belcaro had a hand over his mouth. Dos Pell was praying under his breath, and Marta Iden stood with her palm still flat on the plate, and her chin up, and her old eyes dry, because she had spent her whole life waiting to do this one thing, and she was not going to do it with tears. Up on the surface, Cass had not yet returned, but 3,000 others felt it before they heard it. A vibration came up through the soles of their boots, low and enormous, a sound that was less a sound than a change in the weight of the world. The grain in every plot for 40 kilometers bent all at once, though there was no wind. Birds went up off the silver roofs in a single startled cloud. The water in the irrigation channels shivered and stood up in standing waves. Old Oren Vale, still in the settlement hall, put a hand on the table to steady himself, and felt the table itself humming, and he looked at his daughter, and his daughter looked back at him with wide, bright eyes, because she had felt it too. The whole colony had, the world itself waking up beneath them. And out at the edge of the settlement, where the cemetery sat on its quiet hill, the ground began to open. It did not open like an earthquake, it opened like a thing remembering how. Great seams of stone that had looked for 60 years like ordinary ridges and dry riverbeds, split along lines no geologist had ever questioned. Lines that ran straight as a ruler for kilometers, because they had been cut that way by hands long dead. And from the seams came light, deep amber light, the color of the planet's own heart, and then came the prows. They came up slowly, because 9 kilometers of warship does not hurry. The first prow broke the surface beyond the cemetery hill, shedding dirt and stone and 60 years of buried patience, and it rose, and rose, and kept rising, until it blotted out a third of the sky. The people of Harrow's Rest stood in their yards and their fields with their mouths open, and watched a thing the size of a mountain range climb out of the world they had farmed their whole lives. Along its flank, as the dirt fell away in slow cascading sheets, they could read a name in letters 10 meters tall, and the name was Account Settled. Behind it, around the whole curve of the horizon, the others were rising too. 11 of them. 11 mountains of dark metal pulling themselves up out of the farms and the foothills and the dry seabeds. 11 prows lifting toward a sky that still held the cold blue letters of an ultimatum that had not yet understood it was already void. The people could read their names now as the light caught them, name after name passing overhead, like a litany the colony had never been taught and somehow always known. Account settled, the long memory. No quarter asked, Harrow's answer. Late fee. A man in the eastern fields read that last one aloud, late fee, and laughed, a short startled bark of a laugh, because some engineer 60 years dead had named a 9-kilometer dreadnought late fee, and had clearly meant it as a promise, and the laugh spread down the field line, and grown men wept and laughed at once, because the thing that had been buried under their whole lives was rising now, and it had a sense of humor, and somehow that was the thing that broke them open. The deep-keeled dreadnoughts did not roar. They did not announce themselves. The galaxy had never heard of them, and that was the whole design, because the ledger could only catalog what it had seen, and no living thing had ever seen one of these, and lived to file a report. They simply rose, 11 of them, until they hung over the colony like a second range of mountains, and then their engines steadied, and the amber light along their hulls cooled to a hard, clean white, and every gun that had slept for 60 years opened its eyes at once. Far above the planet, in the bookkeeping silence of high orbit, the ledger of the assembled worlds finally registered an anomaly. The ledger was not a ship in the way the colonists would have understood a ship. It was a structure of linked vessels and processing cores 300 kilometers across, a slow, drifting cathedral of administration that had absorbed the technology of 300 worlds and turned all of it toward the single task of counting and correcting. It did not feel surprise, because surprise was an inefficiency it had edited out of itself centuries ago. But it had subsystems whose entire function was to notice when reality stopped matching the record, and all of those subsystems lit up at once. The record said, Harrow's Rest had a fleet presence of 0. The 11 objects now rising off the planet's surface, each massing more than any single vessel in the ledger's own 300-kilometer body, were not 0. The ledger did the thing it always did, when reality and record disagreed. It assumed the record was incomplete rather than wrong, and it began, with infinite patience, to update the entry. It assigned the 11 objects a provisional category, unregistered hostile assets, and it calculated their threat, and the calculation took longer than any calculation the ledger had performed in 200 years, because the 11 objects kept failing to fit inside the numbers it had for weapons. It scanned them. It found weapon systems it had no entry for. It scanned again, certain its instruments were faulty, and found the same impossible readings, and a third time, and the readings did not change, and slowly, in the cold administrative depths of the oldest predator in the spiral arm, a new value began to assemble itself that the ledger had not computed in all its 900 years. The value was risk. For the first time since it had begun its long crawl through the dark, the ledger of the assembled worlds was looking at something it could not be certain it would win against, and it did not know what to do, because winning had never before been in question. It examined its own architecture for a procedure to follow, and found that it had none, because every procedure it possessed assumed victory as a settled fact and concerned itself only with the bookkeeping of the aftermath. It had 10,000 routines for cataloging a corrected world, and not a single routine for the possibility that a world might correct it. It did the only thing its nature allowed. It issued a correction order. It tagged Harrow's Rest as resolved, the category that meant erasure, and it turned the full weight of its 300 kilometers of inherited weaponry toward the small blue planet, and it prepared to do to humanity what it had done to 310 worlds before, calmly, completely, as a matter of record, because if it simply performed the correction quickly enough, then the anomaly would resolve itself, and the record would balance, and the impossible thing would never have to be true. And down on the surface, Cass Holloway came up out of the maintenance shaft into the light, blinking, with the whole sky full of dreadnoughts above her, and the world she had farmed all her life humming under her boots. And she did not run, and she did not hide, and somewhere very deep in her chest, the warm, fierce thing that Marta Iden had lit was burning now like a forge. The ledger of the assembled worlds fired first, because the ledger always fired first, and it had never once in 900 years needed to fire twice. It opened its correction at the planet with a discharge that the colony's old weather satellite recorded for 3/4 of a second before it stopped recording anything at all. A lance of focused force came down out of high orbit toward Harrow's Rest, toward the silver roofs and the grain plots and the cemetery on the hill, a single beam wide enough to glass a city, the same beam that had ended the last sound on 310 worlds. The ledger fired it with no malice and no haste. It fired it the way a man closes a ledger book at the end of the day, because the figures no longer balanced, and the simplest way to balance them was to remove the line that did not fit. Down on the surface, Cass Holloway saw the sky catch fire. The beam came down out of high orbit like a falling pillar of pure light, and for one long instant she was certain she was about to watch her whole world die, and she did not look away, because if Harrow's Rest was going to end, then she was going to see it end, standing up with her chin out like an old woman in a hall. 3,000 people stood in their fields and looked up at the falling light and did not run, because there was nowhere to run, and because, somehow, after the morning they had had, running no longer seemed like a thing humans did. The line did not remove. The dreadnought named No Quarter Asked moved between the colony and the beam. It did not dodge. It did not raise a shield in the way the ledger understood shields, a thin, desperate film of energy that bought a doomed world an extra second. It simply put 9 kilometers of itself in the path of the correction, and the correction struck it, the most powerful weapon the ledger possessed, the inherited death of 300 worlds, and it hit the flank of No Quarter Asked, and it stopped. It did not pierce. It did not even mark. The hull of the deep-keel dreadnought had been built by people who had studied the corrected worlds, who had recovered the last broken recordings of what the ledger's beam could do, and who had then spent 20 years building something it could not do anything to at all. The beam splashed across the dreadnought's flank like water against stone, and it scattered, and it dimmed, and it died, and no quarter asked hung there in the sky exactly where it had been, unmoved, unhurt, with the cooling glow of the strongest weapon in the spiral arm fading harmlessly from a hull that did not even register it as an attack. Down in the fields, the strangest sound rose from the colony of Harrow's Rest. It was not a cheer. It was lower than a cheer, and it came from deeper. 3,000 people had just watched the weapon that ended 300 worlds break against a wall that humanity had built and buried under their feet. And the sound that came out of them was the sound of people who have just learned, all at once, that the thing they were taught to fear their whole lives can be stopped. Cass found that she was making the sound too, and that her face was wet, and that her hand had closed so hard on her glove that her knuckles ached. In high orbit, the ledger ran the event through its subsystems 40,000 times in a tenth of a second, looking for the error. There had to be an error. Its weapon could not have failed, because its weapon had never failed, and a thing that has never failed has no procedure for failure. It checked its own discharge, nominal. It checked the impact, confirmed. It checked the target's integrity, and the target's integrity was 100%. And the ledger, for the first time in its existence, encountered a result that its entire architecture had been built to consider impossible. It did not panic, because it could not panic, but somewhere in its vast cold body, a process that had run uninterrupted for 900 years, the process that called itself certainty, stuttered, and skipped, and for a fraction of a second did not know what to do. Then no quarter ask answered, and the galaxy learned what the dreadnoughts were for. The dreadnought did not fire a beam. It fired something the ledger had no entry for, a weapon the planners had named only in their private files, and it crossed the distance to high orbit in less time than the ledger took to notice it had been fired. It struck the ledger's forward processing spire, one of the great cathedral towers that the ledger had grown from the bones of a corrected world 4 centuries before. And the spire did not glow, and it did not buckle. It simply ceased. One instant it was there, a 100-meter monument of administration, and the next instant, the space where it had been held, nothing at all, not wreckage, not light, just a clean absence, as if the dreadnought had reached into the ledger's record and deleted an entry. The ledger felt that. It had 10,000 spires and processing cores, and the loss of one was statistically trivial, but the ledger had not lost anything in 400 years, and the loss registered through its whole vast body like the first crack through a frozen lake. It was not the size of the loss that mattered, it was the fact of it. For 900 years the ledger had been the thing that subtracted, and now, for the first time, something had subtracted from the ledger, and the institution that had taught the entire spiral arm to fear subtraction discovered what the lesson felt like from the other side. The ledger tried to understand the weapon. This was its nature, even now, even struck, even cracked. The first thing the ledger did was reach for a category. It examined the absence where the spire had been, and it searched its 900-year catalog for any record of a force that did this, that did not burn or break or shatter, but simply removed, cleanly, completely, leaving nothing behind to measure. It found nothing. In 300 corrected worlds, in the absorbed technology of 300 dead species, in 9 centuries of cataloging every weapon the spiral arm had ever raised against it, the ledger had no entry for a thing that could unmake a piece of itself and leave no wreckage to file. The humans had built a weapon specifically outside the ledger's catalog, a weapon the ledger could not name, and a thing the ledger could not name was a thing the ledger could not plan against, and a thing the ledger could not plan against was, for the first time in 900 years, simply a thing the ledger had to endure. That was the architect's deepest cruelty, if cruelty was the word for it. She had not only built a weapon that could hurt the ledger, she had built one the ledger could not categorize, because she had understood that the ledger's true strength was not its guns, but its certainty, its 900-year faith that everything in the dark could be measured and known and filed, and that to break the ledger, you had first to break that faith. The weapon that erased the spire erased something else as well, something the ledger needed far more than the spire. It erased the ledger's certainty that it understood the universe, and a bookkeeper who can no longer trust that the books describe the world is not a bookkeeper anymore. It is only a frightened thing surrounded by numbers it does not believe. Down on the surface, Cass Holloway saw the flash in the sky and did not understand it, and then she saw the next 10 flashes, and she began to understand. Because the Dreadnoughts were rising now, all 11 of them lifted away from the planet they had been buried under, climbing toward the orbit where the ledger waited, and they did not climb in a panic or a charge. They rose in formation, slow and even, and terrible. 11 mountains of dark metal ascending through the high cold air, with their white hull light burning steady, and they spread as they rose, opening into a wall, a line, a wall of dreadnoughts across the sky of Harrow's Rest, and on the flank of each one, a name caught the light. Account settled, the long memory, Harrow's answer, late fee. 11 names that the ledger had no record of, rising to collect a debt the ledger had not known it owed. Cass watched them go, watched the 11 mountains lift away from her world and into the dark, and she thought of the dirt she had been kneeling in that morning, the cold ordinary dirt of her seed plot, and she understood now that she had spent her whole life kneeling in the soil over the most dangerous fleet in the galaxy, planting grain in the thin skin of Earth above weapons that could break the thing that broke worlds. And she had never known, and that was the point. That was the whole beautiful, brutal point, and she laughed out loud at the size of it, alone in her field, with the sky full of her own people's making. Around her, the colony watched too. Oren Vale stood in the road outside the settlement hall with his daughter pressed against his side, and he watched the dreadnoughts climb, and he understood, slowly, that the men and women he had governed for 11 years, the farmers whose fence disputes he had settled, and whose water rations he had approved, had been standing on this their whole lives, that the colony he thought he knew had a second self sleeping beneath it, vast and patient and terrible, and that he had governed only the surface of his own world without ever once suspecting the deep. He was not angry to have been kept in the dark. He understood, looking up, exactly why he had been. He had nearly told them to comply. He had nearly knelt. A man who would nearly kneel is a man the architect had been right not to trust with a fleet, and Oren Vale knew it, and the knowledge did not shame him, because the old woman had stood up before he could fall, and the colony had risen with her, and the deep had heard, and that was how it was always meant to work. The fleet did not protect the leaders. It protected the courage of the led, and the courage had been there, in the end, in a crowded hall, in 8 words from an 86-year-old woman, exactly where the architect had buried her faith that it would be. The wheat bent in the wind off the foothills with its sound like an ocean, and above it, 11 dreadnoughts climbed into the dark to settle a debt 60 years in the carrying, and Oren Vale held his daughter and watched, and for the first time since the letters filled the sky, he was not afraid. The ledger reassessed. It was very good at reassessing. It saw 11 hostile assets it could not damage, and that could damage it, and it did the mathematics of its own survival for the first time in 9 centuries, and the mathematics came back wrong. It could not win this in high orbit. The numbers were plain, and the ledger had never in its existence flinched from a plain number. So it did what it had never had to do, and it began to withdraw, and it issued, on every frequency it possessed, the message it had used 3 times in its long history to end a fight it could not be bothered to finish. The message was, engagement is unprofitable, disengaging, compliance no longer required. It was, in the ledger's 900-year language, mercy. It was the closest, the oldest predator in the spiral arm had ever come to backing down. It was the institution, telling the small blue world, we will not correct you after all, we will simply leave. Log this as an exception, and move on. 300 worlds had never gotten that message. Harrow's Rest had it offered in the first 90 seconds of the fight. The very thing every corrected world in history would have given anything to hear. The word that meant survival. The open door. And the dreadnoughts kept coming. Because the refusal was not a defense. The planners had understood the ledger better than the ledger understood itself. They had known that a thing which catalogs the galaxy does not stop because one entry fights back. It simply files the entry under too costly to correct, and it moves on, and it corrects the next world, and the next. And it remembers, in the patient way of institutions, to come back for the difficult one in a century or two when its weapons have improved. A defense that lets the ledger leave is not a defense. It is a delay. And the people who built the deep keel had not buried 11 dreadnoughts under a farm for 60 years to buy a delay. There was a deeper reason still, and it was the reason the dead planner's voice in the vault had been so careful with its words. The planners had not built the fleet only to save Harrow's Rest. If saving Harrow's Rest had been the goal, the dreadnoughts could have driven the ledger off and gone back to sleep, and the colony would have lived, and the galaxy would have gone on exactly as before, and 300 more worlds would have been corrected in the centuries to come. The planners had wanted more than survival. They had wanted an end. They had built a fleet not to win a battle, but to settle a debt, the oldest debt in the spiral arm, and a debt is not settled by letting the borrower walk away. So when the ledger turned to withdraw, the dreadnought named the Long Memory transmitted a single reply, on the same frequency, in the ledger's own administrative tongue, and the reply was the reason the planners had built the fleet at all. "Your account is not closed," the Long Memory said. "You opened 310 of them. We are here to settle all of them." The ledger of the assembled worlds did not understand the message at first, because it did not have a category for being held to account. It had spent 900 years as the thing that accounts, never the thing that is accounted. It had erased 310 worlds, and filed each one as resolved, balanced, closed, done. It had never once imagined that resolved was a number someone might be keeping. It had never imagined that the dark it crawled through might contain a creditor. The very grammar of the message was foreign to it. In the ledger's language there were words for debtor, and for entry, and for correction, but there was no word for the thing that comes to collect from the collector, because in 900 years, no such thing had ever existed, and a thing that has never existed needs no word. But humanity had been counting. From the day the first human colony recovered the last broken recording of a corrected world, and understood what was loose in the spiral arm, humanity had been counting every erased species, every glassed planet, every silenced sky, and it had written all of it into the keels of 11 dreadnoughts, and buried them under a farm, and waited, 60 years, for the ledger to be foolish enough to come for one of them. Humanity had kept the books the ledger thought only it could keep. Humanity had made itself the creditor of the oldest predator in the galaxy, quietly, patiently, over 3 generations, growing grain on the surface, and grievance in the deep, and now the books were open, and the debt was due, and the borrower had nowhere to run. And the ledger had come, and the dreadnoughts had risen, and now the oldest predator in the galaxy was trying to leave, and it was learning, far too late, that the small, soft farmers it had measured so carefully had built something that did not let the ledger decide when the engagement ended. For 900 years, the ledger had chosen the beginning and the end of every encounter, had opened each account and closed it on its own terms, and it had never once considered that this power, the power to decide when a thing was finished, was itself a kind of weapon, and that someone might take it away. Down on the surface, Cass Holloway watched the 11 dreadnoughts close on the drifting cathedral in the high dark, watched them refuse the open door, watched her own species decline to be spared the way it had declined to kneel, and she understood that she was not watching a rescue. A rescue would have ended already. She was watching something older and harder and more patient than a rescue. She was watching a debt come due, 310 worlds worth, carried 60 years under a field of grain, and she stood in the cold dirt where it had been buried, and she watched it be paid. The 11 dreadnoughts closed the distance to high orbit, and they did not let the ledger run, and the settling of 310 accounts began. The ledger of the assembled worlds had 300 kilometers of body, 10,000 processing spires, and the inherited weaponry of 300 dead worlds, and it brought all of it to bear at once, because it had finally accepted that it was in a fight, and the ledger, when it accepted a thing, accepted it completely. It stopped trying to withdraw. It could not withdraw fast enough, and its survival mathematics had updated again, and the new answer was that running exposed more of its body than standing, so it turned its full cathedral mass toward the 11 dreadnoughts, and it fired everything it had. 10,000 weapon ports opened along its hull. Beams and lances and clouds of correction fire poured out of the great drifting structure, in a wave that would have ended any fleet the galaxy had ever assembled. a wall of light wide enough to have erased a dozen worlds, all of it converging on 11 points in the high cold dark above Harrow's Rest. It hit the Dreadnoughts, and the Dreadnoughts went through it. That was the part the ledger could not process, the part that broke something in its 900-year certainty. The fire did not stop the Dreadnoughts. It did not even slow them. The full converged might of the oldest predator in the spiral arm washed over 11 mountains of dark metal, and the metal drank it, and the Dreadnoughts came on through the storm of it unmarked, their white hull light burning steady through a hurricane of force that should have ended anything, and not one of them so much as altered course. Down on the surface, Cass Holloway watched the whole top of the sky turn to fire, and then watched 11 black shapes come gliding out of the fire untouched, and she understood, in a way that went down past thought into the marrow of her, that she was watching her own species be something she had never known it could be. She thought of all the years she had spent believing humans were small. Everyone on Harrow's Rest believed it. They were 3,000 farmers on a planet at the edge of the dark, growing grain, mending fences, burying their dead on a hill, and the galaxy around them was full of ancient things, hives and predators and cataloging institutions 900 years old, and a human learned early to think of herself as something the dark might step on without noticing. And now Cass stood in her field and watched 11 human-made mountains shrug off the death of 300 worlds as if it were rain, and the smallness she had carried her whole life cracked and fell away from her, and what was underneath it was not pride exactly, it was recognition. As if she had always known this, and only now remembered. The ledger fired until its weapon cores ran hot, and the Dreadnoughts crossed the last of the distance, and then they were among it, 11 9-kilometer hulls moving through a 300-kilometer cathedral of administration, and they began to take it apart. They did not do it cruelly. The planners, in their old wisdom, had built the Dreadnoughts to settle accounts, not to revel, and the distinction mattered more than anything else in the whole design. A fleet built to revel would have become a thing as monstrous as the ledger itself, and the planners had been afraid of that. More afraid of it, perhaps, than of the ledger, because they had understood that a people who build a weapon to answer a monster are always in danger of becoming the next monster. So they had bound the Dreadnoughts not only to defiance, but to justice, and the difference showed in everything the 11 ships did in the high dark that day. The Dreadnought named Harrow's Answer drove straight into the heart of the ledger's central registry, the great core where 900 years of catalog was stored, the memory of every world it had measured, and every world it had erased, and it did not blast the registry to wreckage. It reached into it. The Dreadnought carried systems the humans had built for one purpose, to read the ledger's record and to rewrite it, and Harrow's Answer found the entry for the first corrected world, a planet that had died 4 centuries before any human ever heard of the dark, and it changed the entry's disposition from resolved to remembered, and it did the same for the second world, and the third, and it went down the whole long list of 310, faster than the ledger could stop it, unresolving the dead. It could not bring them back. Nothing could bring them back. But the ledger had built its entire self on the certainty that resolved meant finished, meant safe, meant a thing it could file away and never think of again. And Harrow's Answer reached into that certainty and broke it, one entry at a time, until the ledger's central registry held 310 open accounts where there had been 310 closed ones, and the institution that had never once been wrong was now wrong 310 times in its own memory, and it could feel the wrongness spreading through every core it had. Each unresolved entry was a small, unbearable thing, a world the ledger had told itself was finished, now declared unfinished by a hand the ledger could not stop. And 310 of them together were a weight the oldest predator in the galaxy had never had to carry, the weight of every world it had ended, restored to its memory all at once, refusing to stay closed. There was a deeper purpose to it, beyond the wounding, and Harrow's Answer carried it out with the same patient care. As it changed each entry from resolved to remembered, it copied the entry, whole, into its own keel, the name of the world, the species that had lived there, the shape of their cities, and the sound of their songs, insofar as the ledger had recorded them, because the ledger, in its long thoroughness, had recorded a great deal before it erased each world, the way a man might photograph a house before he burns it. 310 worlds had died, but the ledger had kept a record of every one, and now humanity took that record, all of it, the only memory left in the universe of 310 dead peoples, and it did not let the record die with the ledger. The dead worlds would never come back. But they would not be forgotten either, not now, because the 11 dreadnoughts of Harrow's Rest had reached into the heart of the thing that killed them and carried their memory out into the light. And humanity would keep that memory the way it kept all its hardest things, quietly, faithfully, forever. The ledger had thought it was the only thing in the dark that remembered. It learned, in its last hour, that it had taught humanity to remember too, and that humanity was better at it, because humanity remembered the dead, not as closed accounts, but as the living things they had been. Around the registry, the other 10 dreadnoughts worked. Account settled took the ledger's forward weapon spires, the 10,000 ports that had just failed to stop it, and it closed them, one cathedral tower after another simply ceasing under its impossible weapons, clean absences blooming through the ledger's body where its teeth had been. It did not scatter the wreckage across the dark, did not leave a debris field to fall on the colony below. Each spire it took whole and clean, and the ledger felt its own teeth go out one by one, felt the long reach that had touched 300 worlds shorten and shorten, until the institution that had never once been disarmed found that it could no longer threaten anything at all. No quarter-ask took the propulsion, the great slow drives that had carried the ledger on its 900-year crawl through the spiral arm, and it stilled them, gently, so that the cathedral that had moved through the dark for 9 centuries, finally, for the first time, stopped. The long memory took the great drifting processing cores that the ledger used to assign its categories, the cold engines of judgment that had labeled 300 worlds as resolved and humanity as pending compliant, and it shut them down, core by core, until the ledger could no longer assign anything to anyone. Late Fee, the dreadnought some long-dead engineer had named as a joke, drove the length of the ledger's spine and severed it, and the 300-kilometer cathedral of administration came apart down its center, slowly, enormously, into 2 drifting halves that no longer spoke to each other. The other dreadnoughts moved through the dying cathedral with the same unhurried purpose, each to its task. The long patience and the stone refusal took the ledger's outer defenses, the screen of lesser vessels the institution had grown around itself over centuries, and they did not destroy them so much as separate them, herding them off into the dark, scattering the swarm that had hunted 300 worlds without leaving a single hull intact enough to be a threat again. The quiet verdict and the open account took the ledger's communication array, the vast antenna fields it used to broadcast its ultimatums across the spiral arm, the voice it had used to tell 300 worlds to hold still while they were entered, and they silenced it, all but one channel, the one the humans would leave open on purpose for what came next. And the 11th dreadnought, the one the colony had not been able to read a name on as it rose, the one that had risen last and quietest from beneath the cemetery hill itself, did nothing at all but hang in the high dark above the broken ledger, watching, a witness, because the architect had written into the design that the settling of so great a debt should not happen without one ship whose only task was to see it done and carry the seeing home. That 11th dreadnought was named, the colonists would learn much later, simply Witness, and it watched the oldest predator in the galaxy come apart, and it remembered every moment of it, so that humanity would always know exactly what it had done, and why, and never let itself forget the weight of having done it. And the ledger, for the first time in 900 years, was afraid. It would not have called it fear. It had no category for fear. But every subsystem it had left was reporting catastrophic, unrecoverable, terminal, and the ledger ran its survival mathematics one last time, and got, at last, an answer with no positive value in it, and the absence of any path to survival was, in the only language the ledger had, the precise definition of fear. And in that fear, the ledger did a thing it had never done. It looked back across its own 900 years, across 310 corrected worlds, and for the first time, it saw them not as entries, but as the things they had been. Worlds with halls and harvests and old women who refused to kneel, and it understood, far too late to matter, what it had been, and what it had done, and the understanding was the last and worst correction the ledger ever received, and it received it from itself. It did the only thing left to it. It broadcast, on every frequency in the spiral arm, not to the dreadnoughts now, but to everyone. To all the assembled worlds it had spent 900 years cataloging, a message it had never sent, and had never imagined needing to send. The message was a warning. It said, "There is a thing in the dark that settles accounts. Do not open them." It was the ledger's last act, and it was, in its way, the most human thing the institution had ever done, because it was an institution trying to save the others by confessing that it had been wrong. 900 years of certainty, of never once admitting an error, ended in a single transmission that was nothing but an admission of error, broadcast to a whole galaxy that had been taught by the ledger itself that error was impossible. And humanity let it send the warning. The dreadnought named the Long Memory, which had been built to read and rewrite the ledger's record, could have silenced that final broadcast in an instant. It did not. It let the warning go out across the whole spiral arm, to every predator and every clerk, and every patient cataloging thing that had ever measured a small soft world and found it harmless. Because the planners of Harrow's Rest had understood the last and deepest thing about the ledger, which was that a warning travels further than a fleet, and a galaxy that has heard the warning does not need to be conquered. It only needs to be told. Down on the surface, Cass Holloway stood at the lip of the maintenance shaft with the whole colony around her now, 3,000 people who had come up out of their houses and their fields to watch the sky, Oren Vale with his daughter on his shoulders so she could see, old Bel Caro and Doss Pell come up from the deep vault with their faces still wet, all of them together in the cold morning, watching the two drifting halves of the oldest predator in the galaxy fall silent above their world. No one spoke. There were no cheers now. There was only the vast quiet of people watching the end of the thing their whole civilization had been afraid of, and the quiet was its own kind of sound. 3,000 held breaths, 3,000 hearts learning at the same moment that the dark was not, after all, ruled by the things that hunted in it. They watched the dreadnoughts gather the last living cores of the ledger, not to destroy them, but to read them, to take the full 900-year catalog of every world the ledger had measured, every star, every species, every account still open out there in the dark, so that humanity would know exactly where to go next, and who else was waiting to be defended, and who else had been resolved, and was waiting to be remembered. The dreadnoughts moved through the dead cathedral, with a slow, deliberate care, like people walking through a house where someone has just died, taking only what mattered, leaving the rest in its silence. And then the 11 dreadnoughts turned, slowly, in the high, cold quiet, and they looked back down at the small blue planet they had been buried under for 60 years, and they did the thing the ledger had measured them for, and gotten wrong in every particular. They did not leave. They did not file Harrow's Rest under too costly and move on. They came home. One by one the dreadnoughts descended through the clearing sky, settling back toward the seams they had risen from, the dry seabeds and the foothills, and the ground beyond the cemetery, and as account settled past low over the settlement, 9 kilometers of dark metal sliding overhead with its white light cooling back to the amber of the planet's heart, Cass Holloway looked up at the name 10 meters tall on its flank, and found that she was crying, and laughing, and that she did not know which of them she had started with. The shadow of the dreadnought passed over the whole colony, over the silver roofs and the grain and the cemetery hill, a cool dark shadow the size of a mountain, and 3,000 people stood in it, and felt not afraid, but sheltered, as if the shadow itself were a hand laid over them, and then the dreadnought was past, settling toward its seam, and the morning light came back. She was not a fighter. She had never fired a weapon at anything larger than a burrow pest. But she had stood in a hall that morning, while an 86-year-old woman refused to kneel, and she had refused with her, and a kilometer beneath her feet, that refusal had woken 11 dreadnoughts that no power in the spiral arm could stop. And as the great ship settled back into the world she farmed, Cass understood at last what the planners had built, and why they had buried it under grain, and why they had bound it to defiance and to nothing else. They had not built a weapon. They had built a promise, and the promise was simple, and it was old, and it had just been kept in front of the whole galaxy. The promise was that a free people, however small, however soft, however far out in the dark, would never have to kneel, because something they had made with their own hands was always, always listening for the word no. The galaxy received the ledger's last warning 40 days later, because that was how long it took the broadcast to crawl out across the spiral arm, and the galaxy did not know what to do with it. For 900 years, the ledger of the assembled worlds had been the one fixed thing in the dark. Empires rose and fell, hive minds bloomed and starved, predator clans hunted and were hunted. But the ledger went on, measuring, cataloging, correcting. The slow, certain bookkeeper of the spiral arm whose entries none had ever reversed. To the assembled worlds it was less an enemy than a law of nature, like cold, like distance, like the dark itself. You did not fight the ledger any more than you fought gravity. You arranged your existence around it, you paid what it asked, and you hoped that it would never assign you the category that meant erasure. And now the law of nature had sent out one final transmission, fading and broken, and the law of nature had said, "There is a thing in the dark that settles accounts. Do not open them." No one believed it at first. The clerk species and the cataloging things and the patient measuring institutions that made up the higher tiers of galactic order received the warning and filed it, naturally, because filing was what they did, and they assigned it a low confidence rating, because the ledger had clearly malfunctioned, because the alternative was unthinkable. The ledger could not have been defeated. Nothing defeated the ledger. The warning was an error, a glitch, the death noise of a damaged system, and it was entered into 10,000 registries across the spiral arm under the category of unverified, and the galaxy went back to its long, cold business and forgot. It did not forget for long. Because the Dreadnoughts of Harrow's Rest had taken the ledger's full catalog, the 900-year record of every account it had ever opened, and humanity now held in its hands a complete map of every world that had been resolved, and every world that was, at that very moment, being measured for resolution by some smaller predator that had learned the ledger's methods. The smaller predators were the ones who had filed the warning under unverified. They were the clans and the hives, and the lesser cataloging things that had spent 900 years in the ledger's shadow, learning its methods, waiting their turn, dreaming of the day the great bookkeeper finally slowed, and they could carve their own territories out of the dark. And humanity, which had buried 11 dreadnoughts under a single farm and bound them to a single word, turned out to have buried more than 11. Cass Holloway learned this slowly, over the seasons that followed, the way she learned most things, with dirt on her gloves and her head tilted. The colony of Harrow's Rest changed after the day the dreadnoughts rose, but not in the way she had feared. The ships did not stay risen, gleaming and terrible over the silver roofs. They went back down into the deep, all 11 of them, back under the grain and the foothills and the dry seabeds, back to drinking the planet's heat and listening, and the seams closed over them, and within a year you could stand on the cemetery hill and see nothing but ridges and quiet ground, and the wheat coming up gold in the long light, and you would never know, you would never in 1,000 years know, that a fleet that had unmade the oldest predator in the galaxy was sleeping a kilometer beneath your boots. That was the design. Cass understood that now. The dreadnoughts were not meant to be seen. They were meant to be a word the galaxy whispered and did not quite believe, a story the cataloging things told one another in the cold, a doubt that crept into every predator's mathematics when it looked at a small, soft farming world and prepared to measure it. Somewhere down there, the doubt said, somewhere under the grain, you counted everything on the surface. Did you count what was under it? And the doubt did the work that no fleet could have done, by being seen. Because the assembled worlds, for all their 900 years of cataloging, had learned the one lesson the ledger died teaching them. You could measure a world's surface, you could count its ships and its guns and its population, and you could be certain, absolutely certain, of what it would do when you put your blade to its throat. And you could be completely, catastrophically wrong, because the thing that mattered was never on the surface. The thing that mattered was buried down in the deep where no scan reached, in the place where a free people kept the one thing they would never surrender, and you would never see it coming, because it was built precisely so that you would not, until the seams opened and the prows rose and the names 10 meters tall caught the light. The first test of the doubt came in the second year. A predator clan called the Vesh, who had spent a century picking the bones of worlds the ledger had left too weak to defend themselves, came upon a human colony 3 systems from Harrow's Rest, a fishing world of 9,000 souls with no fleet, no guns, and a single old patrol cutter that did not fly. By every measure the Vesh knew, it was prey. They moved in close, and broadcast the demand they had broadcast to 100 weaker worlds, and the fishing colony, which had heard what happened at Harrow's Rest, sent back 2 words, and the 2 words were, "We decline." The Vesh hesitated. That hesitation was the whole victory, and it had been won 60 years before, in a vault under a farm, by people who would never know the Vesh existed. The clan ran its mathematics, and the mathematics were the same as always: a helpless world, an easy correction, and then the doubt crept into the numbers, the buried doubt, the thing under the grain. They had heard the warning. They had filed it under unverified, but they had heard it. And now, a soft fishing world that should have begged was declining. Instead, calmly, the same word, the exact same word, that the farmers of Harrow's Rest had used the day the oldest predator in the galaxy came apart in the high dark. The Vesh looked at the fishing world and could not be sure. And a predator that cannot be sure is a predator that has already lost its appetite, and the Vesh withdrew, and filed the fishing world under a category they had to invent, and moved on, and the fishing world never knew how close it had come, or how a fleet it did not have had saved it. There was a fleet under the fishing world. There was a fleet under a great many worlds, but the Vesh did not know that, and the not knowing was the weapon, and the weapon worked. Word of the fishing world reached Harrow's Rest the next season, carried by a trade hauler, and Cass heard it in the market, and did not understand at first why the 9 who knew, the keepers of the secret, went so quiet when they heard. She found Bel Caro that evening, the thresher who had held the door for her, an old man now, and she asked him what it meant, and he looked at her a long while, and then he told her a thing she had not known. He told her that Harrow's Rest had not been the only colony the architect built. He told her that the day the Dreadnoughts rose, the day the colony refused, and the Deep answered, humanity had taken the Ledger's catalog, the full 900-year map of the dark, and had begun, quietly, to do everywhere what it had done here. He told her that the fishing world 3 systems over had a fleet under it now, sleeping, listening, that its people did not know, that most of the worlds did not know, that the secret was being kept the way it had always been kept, in the dark, by a handful in each generation, so that the galaxy would never be able to find the fleets it could not stop being afraid of. And Cass understood then that the morning she had refused had not saved one world. It had started something. It had been the first stone of an avalanche that was still falling, world by world, year by year, out across the whole spiral arm, and she had been there at the start of it, kneeling in her seed plot with dirt on her gloves, and she had had no idea. That was the thing about Harrow's Rest, she thought. None of them had had any idea. They had grown grain and mended fences and buried their dead on a hill, and beneath them, the largest quiet thing in the history of the dark had been taking shape, and they had simply lived their small, honest lives on top of it. The fleets were only metal. The secret was only silence. What made the whole thing work, what made the galaxy stand up, was 3,000 ordinary people on a farming world, looking at the end of everything, and deciding, together, in a crowded hall, that they would rather refuse than kneel. The avalanche had started with a choice, and the choice had been made by farmers, and Cass Holloway had been one of them, and she carried that the rest of her life, the way you carry a thing too large to ever fully see. Marta Eden died 2 winters after the day she refused to kneel. She was 88. She went quietly, in her own bed, with the wheat coming up gold outside her window, and Cass Holloway sat with her at the end, because by then, the 2 of them had become something like friends, the old woman who had been the living key, and the grain warden who had followed her down into the deep. Near the end, Marta opened her eyes and looked at Cass and said, "You stood up too, that morning. I saw you. You were going to say it before I did." And Cass said she didn't know what she would have said, and Marta smiled, the way the very old smile at the very young, and said, "It doesn't matter what. It only matters that you stood up. That's the whole thing. That's all it ever was." And then she closed her eyes, and a little while later she was gone. They buried her on the cemetery hill above the spot where the Dreadnought account settled had first broken the surface, and the whole colony came, all 3,000 of them, because every one of them knew that it was her hand on the cold plate that had woken the deep, and her 8 words in the settlement hall that had given them all the courage to refuse. They did not put her rank on the stone because she had none. They put 8 words. We don't kneel. We didn't cross all that dark to come here and kneel to a clerk. Cass Holloway stood at the graveside with dirt on her gloves, because she had come straight from the seed plots, and she looked down at the 8 words, and then up at the quiet ridges where 11 dreadnoughts slept, and she thought about the small blue planet they all stood on, and the long dark all around it, and the galaxy out there slowly learning to be afraid of farms. The years went on. Harrow's Rest grew. More colonists came, drawn to the one world in the spiral arm that no predator would approach, and the grain spread to new valleys, and new silver roofs went up, and Cass was an old woman herself by the end of it, with grandchildren in the grain, and a bad knee that had gotten worse, and a name that the younger settlers said with a kind of quiet respect she had never asked for, because she had been there, on the morning the sky filled with the cold blue letters, and she had refused. They asked her about it sometimes, the young ones, and she told them the truth, which disappointed them, because the truth was not about the dreadnoughts at all. She did not tell them about the guns or the size of the ships, or the death of the ledger. She told them about an 86-year-old woman standing up in a crowded hall with both hands on a cane and saying 8 words, and how a whole world had stood up with her. That, Cass told them, was when the battle was won. Everything after that was just metal. And in all those years, not one predator came back to Harrow's Rest. Not the clans, not the hives, not the patient cataloging things. The world that had been entered into the ledger as pending compliant was entered now, in every surviving registry in the spiral arm, under a category the assembled worlds had been forced to invent for it, and the category was simply, do not approach. But the dreadnoughts did not sleep only for Harrow's Rest. That was the last thing Cass came to understand, the deepest thing, the thing the planners had built into the whole design from the very beginning. The 11 keels beneath her world were not the only ones. Humanity had taken the ledger's catalog, the full map of every open account in the dark, and humanity had gone out quietly into the spiral arm, world by world, year by year, and it had done on 100 other planets what it had done on Harrow's Rest. It had buried fleets, under farms, under cities, under ice and ocean and red desert, bound each one to the refusal of the people who lived above it, sleeping, listening, waiting for the word no. Some of those worlds knew, most did not. Most of them were ordinary colonies of ordinary people, growing grain or catching fish or raising children, and they went about their lives never knowing that something humanity had made was sleeping under them, bound to their courage, ready to rise the moment they refused to kneel. The galaxy thought it had seen humanity's answer to the ledger rise once, over one small blue world, and be done. It had seen the first of 100. And so the spiral arm entered a long, strange peace that the cataloging things could not explain and did not trust. The predators grew cautious. The clerk species grew careful. The old certainty that a small world was a helpless world, that a surface told the truth, that resolved meant finished, drained out of the galaxy's mathematics, one calculation at a time, and in its place crept the doubt, the buried doubt, the thing under the grain. You could still measure a world. You could still count its ships and its guns, but you could never again be certain, never again, that the soft farmers looking up at your ultimatum did not have 11 mountains of dark metal sleeping a kilometer beneath their boots, bound to a single word, listening for you to be foolish enough to ask them to kneel. And so, slowly, the asking stopped. The ultimatums grew rare and then rarer, and a galaxy that had spent 900 years on its knees before a bookkeeper began, world by world, system by system, to stand up. It was not that humanity had conquered the spiral arm. Humanity had no interest in conquering anything, and that was the final thing the cataloging things could not understand. The dreadnoughts did not go out and demand tribute. They did not catalog. They did not correct. They simply slept under 100 worlds, asking nothing, ruling nothing, listening only for the one human word, and in doing so, they made the entire dark safe for refusal, for every species, not only humanity's own. A hive 300 systems away, with no human anywhere near it, declined a predator's demand one day and lived, because the predator could no longer be sure, and the hive never knew it had humanity to thank, and humanity never knew it had helped, and that was the most human thing of all, a gift, given in the dark to strangers who would never learn the giver's name. Cass Holloway lived to be 90, and on the last clear morning of her life, she had herself carried out to the cemetery hill, to sit in the long gold light with the wheat all around her, and the quiet ridges below where the dreadnoughts slept. Her grandchildren were down in the plots, working the grain, laughing about something she could not hear. The sky was empty and blue, and held no cold letters at all, and had not for 50 years, and she sat there with her ruined gloves in her lap, and she thought about the clerk in the sky that had measured her world so carefully and gotten every single thing about it wrong. It had counted the haulers, and the satellite, and the dead patrol cutter. It had counted the population, and the grain, and the silver roofs. It had counted everything on the surface, and it had assigned humanity a category, pending compliant, a species that would kneel the moment it understood the alternative. It had never imagined that the alternative was the thing the humans had wanted all along. Cass thought about Marta Iden, 86 years old, standing up in a crowded hall with her chin out, and she thought about 3,000 voices saying 8 words, and she thought about the deep vibration coming up through the floor of the vault as 11 engines that had slept 60 years began to turn. She thought about how the whole thing, the dreadnoughts, the death of the ledger, the long peace, the 100 buried fleets, the galaxy learning to stand up, all of it, every part, had rested in the end on a single small human choice, made by a frightened farming colony with a blade at its throat. The choice to say no when saying yes would have been so much easier and so much safer and so much more sensible. The planners had understood that. They had built 9 kilometers of dark metal and bound it, in the end, to the smallest thing in the universe, a single free heart refusing to kneel, because they had known that the smallest thing was also the strongest, and that a galaxy could be saved or lost on it. Cass Holloway closed her eyes in the gold light, and below her the 11 keels slept on, listening, patient, bound forever to a single quiet word, and out across the whole dark spiral arm, 100 more fleets slept under 100 more worlds, and the galaxy, which had spent 900 years certain that the small, and the soft, and the far out always knelt in the end, had learned the one thing humanity had buried under its grain to teach it. The ones who never kneel are the ones you should never have measured.